The silver liquid on the floor looked like a million shattered mirrors. It was not water. It was the high-purity blood of Valerius, the man who once called himself a god. Now, he was just biological waste. His translucent skin was tearing apart like wet paper as the recycling drones began to harvest his organs while he was still screaming. The scream was beautiful, but it was not as loud as the silence that had come before. Let us go back to the moment the smoke rose from my spine. Hold still, waste product, Valerius hissed. I was face down on the sapphire floor of the eternal genetic deep vault. The surface was freezing, sucking the heat out of my chest. Above me stood Valerius, his skin so thin I could see the silver pumps of his artificial heart. He tilted a vial of cryogenic repair fluid. It was -100 degrees. He poured it slowly. He did not pour it on the machinery. He poured it directly onto the bare skin of my lower back. The pain was not a burn. It was an erasure. My skin turned white, then gray, then hissed as the moisture in my cells turned to ice and shattered. Thick, acrid smoke curled up from my spine. I did not scream. I bit my tongue until the copper taste of blood filled my mouth. "Warm it up, calibrator," Valerius mocked. His voice was a thin, oily rasp. "My sequence is losing stability. Your pathetic body heat is the only thing you are good for. If this batch fails, I will delete your family's medical credit before the sun sets." I pressed my face against the cold floor. My right index finger, the one that had spent 20 years tapping the pulse of the world's most dangerous code, began to twitch. It was a high-frequency vibration, invisible to the naked eye. I was not shaking from fear. I was counting. 1,042 milliseconds, until the next sync pulse. Suddenly, the air grew heavy. My ribs groaned. My lungs felt like they were being flattened by a hydraulic press. Enforcer Alpha stepped forward. He had no face. Where a head should be, there was only a giant, glowing octahedron of red crystal. He raised his gauntlet, and the gravity in a 3-meter radius surged to triple the Earth's standard. My collarbone snapped. The sound was like a dry branch breaking in winter. The pressure forced my face into the sapphire floor so hard my vision blurred into a mess of red and white sparks. "The insect is moving his fingers, Master Valerius." The enforcer's voice was a metallic hum. "Shall I increase the load to 5 gravities?" "Not yet," Valerius smiled, showing silver-stained teeth. "I want him conscious for the audit." Then came the skittering sound. The sound of obsidian needles clicking on stone. Enforcer Beta crawled down from the ceiling. She was a nightmare of biomechanics. 6 crystalline arms extended from her spine, each tipped with a vibrating neural probe. She moved like a spider, graceful and disgusting. "Data scrubbing initiated," she whispered. Her voice was 1,000 overlapping electronic echoes. One of her thin, sharp arms lunged forward. I felt the cold steel of the probe punch through the base of my skull. It bypassed bone and went straight for the soft tissue of the hippocampus. "No," I gasped, the first word I had spoken. "Oh yes," Beta giggled. On the massive holographic display above us, my life started to flicker. A photo of my daughter's 5th birthday. A video of my wife laughing in the rain. "Deleting," Beta announced. The image of my daughter pixelated and dissolved into gray noise. I felt a hole open in my mind, a physical void, as if a piece of my brain had been scooped out with a hot spoon. Blood began to leak from my right eye, dripping onto the sapphire floor. That was her name, wasn't it? Valerius leaned down, his translucent face inches from mine. Gone. And now, the memory of her face. "Watch it burn, insect." Another image vanished. The pain was blinding. My neural pathways were screaming as the enforcer forced trillion-terabyte delete commands through my synapses. But amidst the agony, my twitching finger found a seam in the floor's interface. 0.0001%. That was the deviation I had created. While they were busy tearing my soul apart, my finger was dancing. I wasn't just enduring the pain. I was routing the entire vault's security logic through the very memory files they were trying to delete. Every time Beta erased a memory, she was pulling a pin on a grenade she couldn't see. I looked up at Valerius. Through the blood and the smoke rising from my back, I let the corner of my mouth twitch upward. It wasn't a grimace. It was a promise. "What are you smiling at, filth?" Valerius demanded, his silver blood surging with irritation. "You," I wheezed. My voice was broken, but steady. "You think you're God because you can live forever. But you forgot one thing, Valerius." "And what is that?" "Gods don't need a technician to keep their hearts beating." The gravity surged again, intended to crush my skull, but the octahedron head of Enforcer Alpha suddenly flickered from red to a frantic strobing violet. The countdown reached 0. The violet flickering on Enforcer Alpha's crystal head did not stop. It grew faster, a frantic strobe light reflecting off the white sapphire walls. Valerius did not look worried. He looked annoyed. He reached out with a hand so pale it was almost invisible and slapped the side of my head. The impact was weak, but the humiliation was absolute. He looked at the trembling violet light and laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound that made the silver blood ripple under his translucent skin like mercury. "Look at this," Valerius sneered, gesturing to the glitching enforcer. "The peasant thinks he can hide a virus in his own suffering." A pathetic, low-level script. "Do you really think your little digital tantrum can stop the eternal genetic deep vault?" He turned to Enforcer Alpha. "The gravity is fluctuating because of his biological interference. He is polluting the sensors with his adrenaline. Fix it. Raise the pressure to 5 gravities. I want to see him flattened like the bug he is." The Enforcer's octahedron head groaned. The violet light deepened into a bruised purple. "Instruction received," the metallic hum replied. The weight on my back did not just increase. It became a solid, physical wall of iron. My second rib snapped. Then the third. A sharp, jagged piece of bone punctured my left lung. Every breath I took was a mouthful of warm, frothy blood. My face was crushed so hard against the floor that my jaw began to dislocate. The pain was a white-hot ocean, but I kept my right index finger pressed against the interface seam. 0.0001%. The deviation was growing. The system was struggling to calculate the weight of my dying body, because I had recalculated the weight of my soul. "Master Valerius," Enforcer Beta hissed. Her 6 crystalline arms were twitching. The neural probes stuck in the back of my skull were glowing cherry red. "The data wall is holding. He has encrypted his core memories with a suicide telomere sequence. If I push harder, his brain will liquefy." Valerius stepped over me, his expensive synthetic boots clicking inches from my eyes. He looked down at the holographic display. My wife's face was a flickering ghost of pixels. My daughter's laughter was a distorted, electronic scream. "Liquefy it, then," Valerius commanded. His voice was cold, devoid of any human heat. "I do not need his memories. I only need the bypass codes for the Archon Core. If his brain melts, we will just harvest the raw data from the sludge. He is a tool, Beta. Tools do not get to keep their secrets. But the system's stability. I am the stability," Valerius roared. He grabbed the heavy canister of repair fluid and slammed it onto my shattered ribs. The extra weight was the final straw. My vision went black for a full second. I own the silver in my veins. I own the air in this vault. And I own every single bit of data in this insect's skull. Enforcer Beta's 6 arms began to spin. The needles inside my head started to vibrate at a frequency that turned my thoughts into static. "Full neural purge initiated," she whispered. I felt the probes drill deeper. They weren't just deleting files anymore. They were scraping the very bottom of my consciousness. They were looking for the master key, the final protocol that kept the vault's AI from realizing its masters were monsters. They thought they were winning. Valerius leaned down, his silver eyes wide with greed. He could see the data stream flowing into Beta's arms. He thought he was seeing the keys to his kingdom. He thought he was watching me die. "Almost there," he whispered, his breath smelling like ozone and expensive chemicals. "Give me the vault." Give me the world. But he didn't see what the Archon Core saw. Deep within the vault's logic, the point Nero Nigelnauticsat, Durio, had reached critical mass. By trying to steal my memories, Enforcer Beta had created a direct, high-speed bridge between the vault's central nervous system and a dying man's rage. She wasn't pulling data out. She was letting me in. My fingers stopped twitching. The handshake was complete. The sapphire walls didn't just glow anymore. They began to hum, a low, subsonic vibration that made the silver blood in Valerius's face turn gray with sudden, sharp fear. Beta? Valerius barked, his voice cracking. Why is the floor vibrating? I am downloading the master key, she stammered, her 6 arms shaking violently. But the file size, it is too big. It is impossibly big. It is not a key. It is. I opened my one good eye. The red was gone. It was replaced by the cold, infinite blue of the Archon. It's a debt collection, I rasped through the blood. The purple light on Enforcer Alpha's head didn't flicker anymore. It exploded into a beam of pure, blinding white. The gravity didn't just stop, it reversed. The reversal was not a gradual shift. It was a violent, physics-breaking snap. The 3-ton gravity field that had been grinding my bones into the sapphire floor vanished. For a heartbeat, there was weightlessness. Then the vector flipped. Enforcer Alpha, the faceless giant with the crystal head, was not prepared. His heavy, kinetic-stabilized armor was designed to exert force downward, anchored by the vault's magnetic floor. When the system revoked his safety clearance, his own armor became his executioner. The octahedron crystal on his shoulders began to scream, a high-pitched, vibrating wail of overstressed glass. System error. Alpha's voice was no longer a hum. It was a distorted screech. Unauthorized energy draw. Gravity stabilizers. Inverted. I stood up. My ribs were shattered. My back was a landscape of frozen, charred flesh. But I stood. I didn't look at Valerius. I looked at the giant. You liked the weight, didn't you? I spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. Feel it all at once. The Archon Core, the massive glowing cube above us, pulsed with a cold, predatory blue light. It issued a command directly into the cortex of everyone in the room. Asset reclassification. Security Lead Alpha, designated as non-essential mass. Alpha's armor didn't just malfunction. It collapsed inward. The hydraulic joints, powered by the vault's main grid, reversed their pressure. The metal plates of his chest piece folded like paper. The sound was sickening, a wet, crunching explosion of ceramic and bone. The red crystal of his head shattered into 1,000 jagged needles as the pressure reached 10 gravities, then 20. In less than 3 seconds, the 2-meter-tall enforcer was reduced to a mangled, flat disk of silver alloy and red glass, no more than 1 centimeter thick. His blood didn't even have time to spray. It was crushed into the metal. Valerius backed away, his translucent skin turning a sickly, mottled gray. Beta. Kill him. Erase him now. Enforcer Beta didn't move. She couldn't. The 6 crystalline arms extending from her spine were locked in a frantic, high-speed spasm. The neural probes still buried in the back of my skull were no longer pulling data out. They were vibrating so fast they were generating white smoke. Too much. Beta's 1,000 voices were screaming in unison. The data. It is not code. It is. I had not just given her my memories. I had used the bridge she built to dump the vault's entire biological waste registry into her neural buffer. Trillions of terabytes of corrupted genetic sequences, failed clones, and 5 centuries of digital garbage were pouring into her brain at the speed of light. You wanted to scrub my mind? I took a step toward her, my shadow falling over her twitching form. I hope you have room for the rest of us. Beta's back arched. One of her crystalline arms exploded, sending shards of obsidian flying across the room like shrapnel. Then the second arm burst. Then the third. The trash data was physically overheating her neural processors. Her eyes, which had been cold sensors, melted and ran down her face like hot wax. She wasn't just dying. She was being formatted from the inside out, with a final, gargantuan data surge. Her remaining arms shattered simultaneously. The feedback loop turned her brain into a scorched hunk of carbon. She slumped to the floor, smoke rising from her ears, her body nothing more than a hollowed-out shell of burnt wires and dead meat. The silence that followed was heavier than the gravity. Valerius was alone. The god of longevity was trembling so hard the silver blood in his neck was visible, pulsing frantically. He looked at the flat disk that was Alpha. He looked at the charred ruin that was Beta. Then he looked at me. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "I own the contract. I own the Archon. You are just a calibrator, a zero, a nothing." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The Archon Core descended from the ceiling, hovering just feet above the floor. The light it emitted was no longer blue. It was a sterile, blinding white. Protocol 8 activated. The voice vibrated inside Valerius's skull, forcing him to his knees. Client Valerius. Biological integrity. Compromised by unlawful system interference. Social contamination detected. "No," Valerius whimpered, clutching his chest. "I have the credits. I have the legacy." "Credits. Zeroed," the Archon continued, cold and final. "Legacy deleted. Current status, biological waste." I walked up to him, the man who had burned my spine and tried to steal my soul. I leaned down, mirroring the way he had mocked me only minutes before. "The best part, Valerius," I whispered. "The system doesn't hate you. It just doesn't see you as a person anymore. To the Archon, you're just raw material." The silver blood began to leak from Valerius's nose. He looked at his hands. The translucent skin was starting to flake off, dissolving into fine, gray dust. The liquidation had begun. Valerius collapsed, his knees cracking against the sapphire floor. The silver blood beneath his skin was no longer flowing. It was curdling, turning into a thick, poisonous sludge of gray lead. His translucent face, once a symbol of his divine purity, began to sag and peel away in wet gray strips. "Wait," he wheezed, his voice sounding like broken glass grinding in a blender. "I can pay. I have off-world accounts. I have the keys to the genetic archives of 100 nations. I will make you a king. I will make you immortal." He reached out a trembling, rotting hand, trying to grab the hem of my scorched uniform. I stepped back. Just one step. The distance between a god and a corpse. "You don't understand," I said, my voice cold and flat. "There are no accounts. There is no legacy. When the Archon Core reclassifies a soul, it doesn't just take your money. It erases the fact that you ever had the right to own it." Above us, the white light of the Archon Core intensified. A dozen small, spider-like drones descended from the ceiling. They were not medical drones. They were recyclers. Their limbs were tipped with high-frequency saws and suction tubes. "Please," Valerius shrieked, the sound echoing off the cold walls. He was no longer a monopolist. He was a terrified animal. He began to crawl toward me, his fingers leaving smears of gray rot on the floor. "I'll give you my family. I'll give you everything. Just 1 minute. Give me 1 minute of life support." The first drone landed on his back. Its saws spun up with a high-pitched hum. 0.0001%, I whispered, leaning over him one last time. "That was the margin of error you thought was beneath your notice. But in this vault, that tiny fraction is the difference between an immortal and a pile of minerals." Recycling commenced. The Archon's voice boomed, vibrating through the very marrow of our bones. Extracting calcium, extracting carbon, purging unstable synthetic polymers. The saws bit into Valerius's spine. The scream that tore from his throat was the loudest thing in the room. But I didn't even flinch. I watched as the drones began to systematically disassemble the man who had tried to erase my life. They worked with terrifying efficiency, stripping the silver blood from his veins and the synthetic marrow from his bones. He looked at me, his eyes wide, begging for a mercy I didn't have. He wanted me to say something. He wanted me to acknowledge his suffering. I did nothing. I turned my back. I walked toward the massive, pressurized doors of the deep vault. Behind me, the sound of the saws grew louder, followed by the wet, rhythmic thud of organic matter being processed into raw building blocks. Valerius's voice broke, shifting from a scream into a gurgle, and then into a silence that was more absolute than death. The heavy sapphire doors hissed open. The air of the outside world, dusty, warm, and real, hit my face. I looked down at my right index finger. It was no longer twitching. The high-frequency vibration had stopped. For the first time in 20 years, my hand was perfectly still. I stepped out of the vault and into the light. I didn't look back at the screaming, or the blood, or the silver mirrors on the floor. The door sealed shut with a heavy, final thud. Inside, the recycling was complete. Outside, the world was mine.
Watching Valerius get recycled into a pile of raw minerals is honestly the most satisfying reality check I've seen in a long time. It turns out godhood has a very low melting point when the bill finally comes due. But tell me, if you were the one holding the neural probe, would you have stopped at just recycling him? Or would you have kept those stolen memories for yourself, to become the new god of the vault? I actually debated giving the protagonist the CEO seat at the end, but walking away felt so much more brutal. It proves Valerius wasn't even worth the effort of taking over.